In the midst of divisiveness and absolute chaos in Washington, something is actually getting done on Capitol Hill, a very good thing. One of the biggest, in my opinion, one of the biggest reforms in decades has just passed the Senate.
In my opinion, too. It's called the First Step Act. It's a sweeping bipartisan bill that overhauls parts of the federal criminal justice system. Supporters say it'll make the system fairer, it'll reduce prison overcrowding, and it'll save taxpayer money. Let's talk about what it does specifically. It takes several steps to ease mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent drug offenders. It reduces the three-strike penalty from life behind bars to 25 years. It helps inmates earn reduced sentences for good behavior, and it provides programs to help reduce recidivism, or a repeat of the crimes that got prisoners into prison in the first place. But the bill only affects federal prisons. This is important. There are nearly 81,000 inmates right now. That is less than 10% of America's prison population. That's why this is just a first step. It now goes to the House, where it's expected to pass, then to the president, who signaled that he'll sign it into law.
So yes, it's just 10%, but 10% more than it used to be. So let's look closer at why criminal justice reform is so important. The United States has the world's highest incarceration rate, about 655 per 100,000 people, according to the World Prison Brief database. There's evidence that staying in jail increases crime. The National Institute of Justice says this, quote, "Research has found evidence that prison can exacerbate, not reduce, recidivism. Prisons themselves may be schools for learning to commit crimes. It's also very expensive for you and me, taxpayers. Yeah. It costs approximately $182 billion every single year for all aspects of the incarceration system, from running jails to the cost to families. And there's a big racial disparity in our justice system. According to the Pew Research Center, African Americans make up 12% of the population of U.S. adults, while making up 33% of the prison population. Compare that to white Americans, 64% of the adult population, who make up 30% of prisoners. And consider the toll the system takes on families. The SE Justice Group says 1 in 4 women has a family member that's in prison. For black women, that number is 1 in 2. And according to the Annie Casey Foundation, at least 10 million American children have an incarcerated parent at some point in their lives. We've got to do better, and now maybe we're going to.
We're starting to. Joining us now is Ashley Allison, Executive Vice President at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. She's a former Deputy Director of the White House Public Engagement Office in the Obama administration, where she focused on criminal justice reform. And with us, the Reverend Al Sharpton, President of the National Action Network and host of Politics Nation,
who is
here
so
on MSNBC.
Busy that just while Allie and I were talking, he was even on the
took a phone call, right?
Working. And we do have to mention, as it relates to First Step, look at Twitter. This is something we didn't think we would see going into year end, giving the infighting and talk of a shutdown happening.
Real bipartisanship.
Dick Grassley, who said right there in that clip,
that Jared Kushner helped.
I've spoken to Jared Kushner a lot on this. He has been the driving force behind it. I mean, they had to get Mitch McConnell's daughters to get Mitch McConnell to focus on this. But here we have it, 87-12. That's a big deal.
Right. So, Ashley, we've come some distance because Mitch McConnell wasn't on board. A lot of House Republicans weren't on board. But in fairness, there have been Democrats and Republicans, sometimes for different reasons, who believe that there's something wrong with the system in this country that incarcerates so many people for so long for certain crimes and the damage that does to society. Your organization wrote a letter to the Senate urging it to vote yes on this bill. In your opinion, how important are these reforms in First Step?
I think the most important thing to remind ourselves is that inside all these prisons are actual people who have families and who may have made a mistake but don't deserve to have their entire lives thrown away. So when we think about why we supported the First Step Act, it was super important that there be a sentencing component in the legislation to ensure that people who made a mistake wouldn't fall victim to mandatory minimums. We also think that once people have served their time, there should be re-entry pathways to make sure they can get a job and get housing and can reacclimate back into society. So our sole purpose is, while we don't think the First Step Act solves the entire problem that the war on drugs has created, we also think it will help people who have been, and their families who have been devastated by the criminal justice system.
Reverend Al, does this give you faith that the system works? When you think about criminal justice reform, Unlike many other things, it doesn't have big lobbying dollars behind it, and many of the people it seeks to help can't even vote.
Well, I think that it's a good first step. I think that if it had not been for work done in the House and the Senate and people debating this, many of us in the civil rights community was very concerned that first sentencing was not in, and there were other things not in. And I think that as it moved forward, it gave me hope that the coalitions working with those forces on both sides of the aisle could make a difference, because I think Ashley said it right. We're talking about real human beings, real families. And I might add, this does not take away people being punished for a crime.
That doesn't at all.
It matches the crime and the punishment. And the punishment was so inordinate. I remember that was my problem in the 90s with the crime bill, is that for a minor offense, you get 20, 30, 40 years in wrecked families. People should be able to pay in the same level, or at the same level that the crime was. So I think that they named it right. It's a first step. We have to do other steps. Just
But the
because you
fact
make
that it
one
was
step,
87 to 12, doesn't that
That's
give you
great.
faith that more steps will follow?
It
This
gives
wasn't a
me
narrow
faith
vote.
that there can be a light in a dark tunnel. We just have to make sure that it's not the train coming, that it's sunlight. In this case, it's sunlight, and I think it's a good way to go into the holiday. But we've got to keep going. This does not solve all of the problems.
So, Ashley, the United States, I think these numbers, when you think about, they're important. The United States has about 5% of the world's population, and it's got 25% of the world's total prison population. This deals with, it's not everything everybody wanted, but it only deals with federal prisoners. Most Americans who are in jail are at a different level of prison, not controlled by the federal government. What's your sense of whether this affects that? In other words, does this meaningfully send a signal to states to start to do something different about sentencing and criminal justice?
Well, interestingly enough, many states have actually been leading the way on criminal justice reform in a bipartisan way, whether it's Georgia or California. So I think the states have been leading the way. They were leading it through the Obama administration when we strongly advocated for a bill that included more, that the civil rights community has been advocating for. And so states have been guiding, and the federal government is actually catching up. But I just also want to point out one thing, that while this bill is Reverend Al said, is a first step, there are other ways that this administration can take steps to ensure that our criminal justice system is fair. And that's through the Department of Justice. And there's an AG nomination, an Attorney General nomination that's coming up that oversees the Bureau of Prisons. And so this is all connected. So if we really want to take another step towards justice, we need to ensure that an Attorney General is not going to tell its attorneys in the Department of Justice to prosecute the mandatory minimum and throw the book at everyone. So let's make sure that this is a first step in the right direction and that people continue to follow.
So, Stephanie, you said there's not a lot of money in on this side of the lobbying. There's a whole lot of money in private prisons.
Ding,
right?
ding, 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 ding.
Which is in my opinion, Rev, you know, I think that some things are just perverse incentives from an economic perspective, right? The idea of private prisons, while it may gain some efficiencies over a government-run prison system, is that someone makes more money by having more people in prison.
Well,
there's a lot of money in that.
Well, let's remember, under the Obama administration, they took privatization of federal prisons out.
Yep.
One of the first things President Trump did was to reinstitute privatization of federal prisons. So
can you just explain that one more time? Because I think people forget what Obama did, and it was one of the first things Trump did.
President Obama stopped the privatization of federal prisons because that was under the domain of the executive branch. One of the first things President Trump did was to reinstitute privatization of federal prisons, which the incentive is, it's like building a hotel. You want full occupancy.
Correct.
And I think that you've got to take monetary gain out of the criminal justice system, and that's what privatization does.
Yep.
He being President Trump has said he will sign this bill, which is good, but if he doesn't follow up walking down that path, what we don't want to see is they say, we did this, therefore we can do 3 bad things, and remind you, well, we did that First Step Act, but we're going to go back into other very reactionary things to use this as a cover for some bad things. I give him credit for supporting this, but a broke clock can be right twice a day. Let's see where he goes with the AG and with privatization and with other things going forward.
Well, let's be optimistic. It is the holidays. And
It's
remember,
the
those
holidays.
private prisons, that's who the government hired to build those child detainment camps down in Texas.
That's right. And I'm sure they can do it very efficiently, but it's not really the way we
Indeed.
like
When
it.
they said, how could they build it so quickly? Oh, well, it's the private prisons. When you hand them tens of millions of dollars, they make it happen.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.